Of course, the big news was, or is, that Treasury just released the guidance for the ARPA funds, which we've been waiting for I guess, over 2 months now. And NCSL has been pivotal in sharing thoughts, concerns, suggestions, questions regarding the guidance to Treasury. So we've been waiting with bated breath this entire time. And actually, Jocelyn may have already done that, but we're going to be providing a link, if she hasn't already, to the interim guidance in the fact sheet that just came out. So it should be in the chat box. There it is, right on cue, Jocelyn. Thank you. And yeah, so and also going to be sending out, NCSL is anyway, some other additional information as the day goes on, trying to be as timely as possible. So again, thank you all for joining us this afternoon. My name is Erlinda Doherty, and I'm the director of the Budgets and Revenue Committee, also the staff lead for the state and the task force on the state and local taxation task force, and hopefully our last virtual meeting. So we'll see. We're planning on moving forward with a meeting in the fall that's in person, and we're very, of course, excited about that, as we miss seeing you all. Before we get started, I have with me our esteemed co-chairs, Representative Marvin Abney and Representative John Mocco. I think they'd like to say a couple words.
Thank you. I'm not sure how distinguished we are, but I'll take it any day.
Esteemed. I said esteemed.
Esteemed. Oh, okay. I get it. Okay. Anyway, thank you so much, Erlinda. I really appreciate the opportunity to actually see everybody again. Now, I don't really see you, but I'm like yourself. I can't wait until we're all back in person doing what we do best. But welcome to all, and I hope that everyone in your orbits are safe and well as can be. These are challenging times trying to do stuff virtually. I know that almost all of the hearings that I conduct, as well as the sessions, are done virtually. So we're all getting used to it, but I think we're still getting the people's jobs done. I would also like to take just a second to thank any and all sponsors who keep us going. And, without the help of the sponsors, these kind of conversations just would not be happening. So thank you so much. And we hope that you continue to support us in the future. This is going to be a timely discussion today, I believe. Just in my own orbit, I've had dozens and dozens and dozens of tax bills. We just finished some last week, and that's where I think the second most number of constituents are always concerned about. So it's up to us to keep up to date, both federally and in our own states with that. The federal overview is important to us because it then helps us figure out how we as state leaders, do our thing. So this is so helpful to be able to talk to a lot of our colleagues, to learn from them, and then learn from each other. So I hope that you enjoy the conversation. I know that I will. Unfortunately, I'll have to leave before it's over, but that's to get ready for some other stuff tomorrow. But thank you for being here. I appreciate it. And I guess it goes back to Erlinda or John at this point.
Yeah, thanks, Marvin. I appreciate it. And I won't belabor the point, but I want to do the same thing. I want to thank everybody for attending. And last week, too, we had, I think, 67 members that were on the Pew Trust conversation. And so I, too, am very, very excited that so many of the sponsors have stuck with us through thick and thin. And we're really, really looking forward to getting back in person. And Erlinda and her team, Jackson and the rest of the guys, have been doing just a great job in starting to orchestrate that stuff for September, October, and November. And then our big meeting, of course, in Tampa in November. So that'll be pretty exciting. I do want to welcome my new colleague. I have my ranking member of the Wisconsin Ways and Means, my colleague Tip McGuire, although he shows up as another John Mocco. So there's not two John Moccos with two different faces. One is actually Tip. So I just want to thank him for that. And I want to encourage all the members, as we get geared up again, let's make this a really big dynamic committee. It is very, very pertinent, as Marvin was saying. And so let's get out there, recruit more people from both sides of the aisle. I think it'll only just enrich things altogether. And then the last thing I would just ask everybody to do is think in terms of topics. It's not easy for Erlinda and the team or Marvin and I to come up with things. We're talking about debt. We're talking about stress testing, and I see Wayne is on from our state of Utah. How that, some of those conversations I'd love to be able to have again to provide the tools that we have. Secretary Buttigieg is talking about a vehicle miles traveled conversation, and how do we actually fix and pay for transportation and infrastructure funding. And I'd love to have more conversation on that. States' rights and federalism, which I think we're going to hear a lot more about today, in fact. So any other topics that you have, keep in mind, we originally set up for driving and challenging the Quill decision, and we did all of that. So my question to the rest of the membership is, well, what's next? What should we be attacking and doing? And let's make it significant. So Erlinda, take it away.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Representative Abney and Representative Mako. Always wonderful to have you here, and appreciate you taking the time out to join us, given all of the other competing priorities that you have. So thank you so much. Okay, well, Jocelyn, next slide, please. And just sort of a run of the show for today. Going to just be giving a brief federal overview here, and let my panel do most of the heavy lifting. And then we're going to be taking, I think we factored in a 5-minute break sometime after the federal overview. I think that's what we said, right, Jocelyn? But of course, you are welcome to take a break as needed, since we're going till 4:30. But maybe we'll start a little or leave a little earlier, or finish a little earlier, I should say. And then we'll have a few announcements at the end regarding planning for future meetings and of that sort. So, okay, next slide, Jocelyn. Fantastic. Well, as you know, my original intent was going to be giving an actual analysis of the ARPA guidelines that literally just came out about 5 minutes ago. So that isn't happening right this moment, although I think my colleague Joe will have to be handling maybe some of those questions as we go on, as he's dissecting it really quickly. But let me at least give an overview of the COVID spending that's already been enacted from a sort of a higher level, and then talk about some of the proposed spending that the Biden administration has put forth. And again, the rest of my colleagues will really delve in deep as we go through the panel. So as you know, we've spent about $5 trillion in COVID spending, which is supposed to which will cost $5 trillion over the next 10 years. And you can see here the 6, some will say 5.5 public laws that were passed to deal with the crisis since its inception over a year ago. The most recent being, of course, the American Rescue Plan Act, which gave out $350 billion for state and local and tribal territories to address the COVID pandemic from more of an economic standpoint. Next slide, please. And again, of interest has been, and of course, the CARES Act, which gave $500 billion to state and local aid. In the pot that we were dealing with more closely in my committee, and also with SALT, was the Coronavirus Relief Fund, which at its inception ended up not being as flexible as some states had wanted it to be to help deal with the revenue losses that were expected to be occurring. But however, the plan did allow for money to be used for unbudgeted virus-related expenses. And with respect to the guidance, if you recall, it came out in sort of a piecemeal fashion, which made it challenging for states to figure out how to use correctly or with the intent that was given by the administration, and also put some restrictions on when the funds had to be spent. So that made it a challenge for some states to use the funds ultimately. But in either case, next slide, please. These are the other payroll tax credits and businesses that have been doled out through all the COVID relief packages you can see here. And we'll get into more of the tax, of course, related issues further on the panel, but this is just an overview. You can see what has been given out and enacted since a year ago, since the first bills were passed to help families and businesses address the COVID relief crisis. FFCRA was the first one to establish tax credits for employers, as well as establish emergency paid leave benefits. The CARES Act also established a credit to cover 70% of eligible wages and health benefits. When the ARPA plan modified some of those and extended them through December 31st this year. And the CARES Act also deferred employer payroll taxes in 2020. So next slide, please. And again, an overview or a summary, if you will, of the tax credits for families in all of the COVID packages that have been passed since the beginning of the pandemic. Most recently with the expanded earned income tax credit, which was actually pretty significant, or very significant, I should say, which increasing the age of eligibility, as well as barring individuals who have children from claiming that without Social Security numbers from claiming the credit. It also expanded the tax credit for a year, made it fully refundable, and increased the value and the child and dependent care tax credit in 2021. So that was significant changes for tax credits for families. Next slide. Okay, so now getting into more proposed spending from the Biden administration to address not just COVID relief anymore, but just the general operations of our government, how we're going to monitor and meander through this post-virus. And most recently, the $1.8 trillion family aid plan, which includes provisions for free community college, national paid family medical leave, expanded nutrition assistance, extended child earned income and dependent tax care credits, as well as increasing taxes on wealthy households. And we'll get more into that a little bit later, but just want to give you another overview of sort of where we are right now with the proposed plans from the Biden administration. Next slide. Also, of course, if we've heard of his infrastructure plan, President Biden's infrastructure plan that was recently proposed, $2.2 trillion over 8 years, with a focus on transportation, as well as power grid, broadband, housing, schools. Pretty all-encompassing package there. Also embedded in that program is a plan to increase corporate taxes as well. And then next slide, please. In conjunction with that proposal, his infrastructure proposal was, of course, his next economic proposal, which is to cost $1.5 trillion. I'm sorry, this is the budget. I'm sorry, we're going to the budget proposal now. Which is we're still waiting actually for his official plan to come out. We've gotten sort of straw man proposals. We've seen the outline, the guidelines, but we're still waiting for the actual bills to come through. But you can see here again what his priorities are over the major federal agencies. $14 billion to address climate change, $2.5 billion for agriculture and interior department. And his various priorities here, which we expect to see come forth in some sort of budget plan, we hope, soon. Next slide. Fantastic. And I'll turn it over to my colleague, Joe, now, so you can address the hot item of the day.
Thank you so much, Erlinda. Chair Abney and Chair Macko, appreciate the opportunity to be here, and Erlinda, Jackson, and Jocelyn for including me on the program. Jocelyn, you won't need to advance any slides. My slides were pretty useless leading up to it because we didn't have any guidance, so there wasn't much to say, and now they're completely irrelevant in light of the fact that some guidance has come out. I had about 18 minutes to print it out and look over the 16 of the 151 pages that address the so-called tax mandate, which is the provision in the American Rescue Plan Act that speaks to the ability of state and local governments receiving the federal aid to cut their taxes. And so we'll talk a little bit about that. I was able to go through it and I think create a few high points. So the law, I think, no longer matters. What matters is the guidance. And I say that only partially in jest. The law still matters if you're an attorney general who wants to sue the federal government. It still matters if you're a legislature which disagrees with the rule and wants to sue the federal government, or if you want to write a law review journal or just engage in the sort of fun arguments that us tax people enjoy doing all the time. But for the purpose of legislators who are crafting budgets and looking at making tax changes, I think really the rule as it's come out right now and then forthcoming guidance, because this is not the end of it, is what's most important. So basically there are three salient points as I read it going through the rule. First is you need to determine what your baseline is. And they define the baseline tax revenue in there as tax revenue essentially reported to the Census Bureau for fiscal year 2019. So for most states, that's going to be July 1, 2018 through June 30th, 2019. So that's the base year. And then your next step, if you want to make a tax change, is determine whether that tax reduces net revenue. So you add everything up and determine whether it is a reduction in revenue. And you do that by using the quote ordinary method of determining changes. So whatever your ordinary fiscal estimating process would be appears to be what the rule suggests you should use to determine whether a tax change is a net reduction. So if you determine that your change is a net reduction in revenue, your changes collectively are a net reduction in revenue, then you have to determine whether your overall revenue is higher than the base year plus inflation. So if you're looking to say fiscal year 22, you would look at revenue from fiscal year 19, increase that by inflation, and if after the tax cuts you're still above the base year, then you stop, you're done. It's presumed that organic growth has provided you with the revenues necessary to cut taxes. So that's all you really need to do. The interesting thing is, and maybe it's in there and I didn't find it yet, it doesn't define inflation. We know there are various different measurements of deflation used at the federal level. There is, for example, the measure of inflation that is used for Social Security changes year after year. There's the price deflator that the Fed uses. So I don't know if they're going to further define that or if it's in there and I just didn't see it yet, but it does, that could be an important number, what inflation means. The other thing too is that ordinarily when you're looking at state and local government, if you were creating, say, a baseline, you would look at inflation and population growth. And this doesn't mention population growth at all. So if you're a faster growing state, I saw a Wall Street Journal article saying Coeur d'Alene, Idaho is the place to be now. If you're a faster growing state, it may not you may not even need to worry about this, because if your population is growing sufficiently fast, revenues might be growing well faster than inflation, providing you with essentially a safe harbor where you wouldn't need to worry about this. If you're a state with a flat or declining population, and some census numbers indicated, for example, California experienced its first population decline since 1850, that could have an impact. So that's the first step, or second step, excuse me. First step, determine the baseline. Second step, determine if the changes are a net reduction or a net increase. If they're a net increase, obviously there's nothing you need to worry about. If they're a net reduction, as long as your revenues at the end of the game are above the baseline, you're fine. And then the third step is, if your changes are a net reduction, and if your revenue following the reductions is lower than the baseline as a result of the changes, then you need to determine how you're replacing those revenues. And you can replace them either through tax increases in another area or through spending cuts that are not related to ARPA. So that's the remaining 100 and some odd pages of the rule, is all of the different things that you can invest in. So you'd have to make spending cuts that were unrelated to the ARPA funds. And in any of those cases, then you have no recoupment, as they call it in here, no need to pay back the federal government. There are a few safe harbors as well that are sort of outside of this. Number one is if the changes are de minimis. So de minimis is defined as less than 1% of tax revenues. So let's say you determine your baseline, you determine your cut, and your revenues are actually going to end up lower than they were in the baseline year. As long as the difference associated with the cut is less than 1% of revenues, then you have a safe harbor. The other safe harbor is if you changed administrative interpretations to correct a prior faulty or erroneous interpretation. So I'm going to have to spend some more time thinking about this, but I think what they're getting at is, if a court or administrative tribunal finds that a tax is being improperly imposed or collected, and some sort of administrative interpretation needs to be corrected, that is not considered to be a change that would require calculating a net tax cut. So let's say the Department of Revenue interprets a statute such that it generates $100 million a year. Taxpayers think that interpretation is erroneous. They go to court, taxpayers win, and it turns out that the state should only be generating about $50 million a year under a correct administrative interpretation, and the department issues a new interpretation to align with the court decision, then that would not be something that would need to be calculated for the purposes of recoupment. And then the final safe harbor is conformity to the federal income tax code. Now, the interesting thing in here is that the interim final rule uses different words than the notice they put out a few weeks ago. The notice they put out a few weeks ago said that whether income tax changes that simply conform a state or territory's tax law with recent changes in the federal income tax law are subject to the offset provision, regardless of the particular method of conformity. So the first notice they put out said, it doesn't matter if all you're doing is making some change associated with the federal income tax law, that doesn't implicate this offset provision. In the interim final rule that came out today, it said Treasury previously determined and announced that income tax changes that simply conform with recent changes in federal law. Now, I think there's a difference between simply conform and regardless of the particular method of conformity. Does simply conform mean to not conform? Because I would say that regardless of the particular method of conformity would. Now, most often when a state decouples from or does not conform with the federal income tax provision, it is in a way that actually increases state revenue. And so this wouldn't be considered. But under the TCJA law, there are a number of actions that states have taken to decouple, which arguably reduce revenue. And so it's a question, I think, as to whether decoupling would reduce revenue. Clearly, what Treasury has in mind here are instances where states conform, for example, to the federal treatment of the Paycheck Protection Program loans, or with the new treatment, the income tax treatment of unemployment insurance. But so that's an open question. And speaking of open questions, finally, the guidance poses a number of questions, but doesn't answer them. Presumably at some point in the future, we're going to get answers to those questions. It also contemplates that further guidance is going to be forthcoming, which, as any of us who have done this for any period of time know, there's never really an end of the guidance until people have forgotten that the program existed. And even then, sometimes you still get guidance after the fact. So even with the CARES Act, I think there were 3 or 4 rounds of guidance within the first 6 months of it being adopted. So at this point in time, I would say that the guidance on balance is good in that we have some guidance, and that provides some certainty to state legislatures. So if you're a state, and there have been some states out there that have really been looking at tax cuts because revenues have performed much better than anticipated, if you can look at that FY 2019 year, and you can look at your current year, and you can figure out how much above that baseline you're performing, including inflation, that essentially tells you we have this amount that we can cut if we want to, and still not run afoul of the so-called offset provision, and thus be subject to recoupment of any ARPA funds. And I will stop there and be happy to take questions that I probably can't answer because I just told you everything I've learned in the past 20 minutes.
Joe, could I ask a question? Good.
By all means, yeah.
So I was looking at this right before the call as well, and one of the things that stuck out to me was the limitation on spending cuts as an offset to tax cuts. Obviously, we know what Treasury is trying to do. They want to address that indirect, you can't replace the money with the fiscal recovery funds. But as I read it, it was fairly categorical based on agency or department. So if a department received the benefit of any fiscal recovery funds, it appears that any reduction in spending within that entire department would lead to recoupment if that funding was, if that reduction was used to do a net tax cut. So, I mean, given that this covers education, social services, health, public safety, all of these different areas, it seems like if you receive any funding within any department, you can't cut anything in that department and use it for tax cuts. Is that your interpretation?
Yeah, that was my gut reaction. I'm going to have to read it more because I looked at that and then I said, I'm going to have to spend a lot of time just thinking about if there's an area you could cut spending, which would fall outside of this. And
right.
If you could find that area, would it be even sufficiently large to worry about? And then finally, politically, are you going to actually cut that spending? So I kind of ignored that, Jared. I mean, I looked at it and I said, this is not really how states are going to be. To the extent that a state wants to cut taxes, it's probably not going to come as a function of some sort of spending cuts. It's going to come because organic revenue growth is going to be sufficient to be above the baseline year so that they don't need to go into any machinations to worry about it. And then, I wouldn't be surprised though if there are some states as they look at this that say, we think Treasury's interpreting this too narrowly, and or we think that the 10th Amendment still is a bar to what the federal government is trying to do to us here, which is an interesting thing. And I wouldn't be surprised if there's a case on that simply to prove, if you will, that the federal government can't impose these conditions on states. Or, at least that would be one, I think, perspective that some state policymakers would hold.
Senator Castro, your question?
Thanks, guys. Sorry, I'm actually driving down to session, so I apologize if I sound a little brainy. I have a question. One of the things that we have in the state of Illinois, we have a live theater tax credit, and we wanted to increase the tax credit. It's right now $2 million a year. We wanted to increase it to $4 million to boost up the industry. Under the federal program, states who do that would be punished, or at least that's what we heard. Is there anything that shows that to be true? What are you guys seeing? If anyone wants to give more enhancements to help an industry out, it sounds like under the federal.
You're breaking up a bit, Senator, but I think we got the gist of the question. So I think prior to the guidance, that was the concern, because strictly reading the law as it was written would suggest that any reduction in tax would run afoul of the provision. I think the Treasury guidance is helpful in a couple of ways. First, it sets up the baseline year. So if your revenue is growing, and I know in Illinois, you may not be in as advantageous position as some other states, then you do have some scope to cut taxes. But then also if the changes are these what so-called de minimis, so less than 1% of total revenue. Now, as I read it, you can't calculate it provision by provision, because then that would be really convenient. You could just make lots of little cuts that added up to a lot, to a big cut. But I think, if the change that you're suggesting in a state like the size of Illinois, all else being equal, would fall under the de minimis provision and would not run afoul of ARPA, and thus not subject any of your funds to recoupment. So I would say that would be safe if that were all that Illinois is doing. And I'd have to go do the math, which I'm not going to be able to do right now, about how big that, what 1% is equivalent to for the state of Illinois. But I think, every legislative fiscal office can do that relatively quickly. Here's 1% of our baseline revenue plus inflation. And if you keep your changes under that, then you don't have anything to worry about. Or if you ensure that any reductions are not greater than the increase in revenue over the baseline year. I tried to say that as least confusing way possible.
Thanks.
Well, thank you, Chair Abney and Chair Mako. I'm going to be hanging on here, but I will go on mute. If anything comes up later, happy to address it.
Thank you, Joe. And as I mentioned earlier, expect to also see some information from us coming out in short stead too, as we delve deeper into what these guidelines mean, and of course continue to look to us as being a resource between you all and Treasury too, as I'm sure more clarification continues to come out in the coming weeks and months. Okay, next on the panel is Verenda Smith from the Federation of Tax Administrators. Verenda?
Hey, everybody. Boy, if you want to know what stress is on a speaker, try following that topic. It's the one everybody has been waiting to hear about. And my topic is, of course, a little bit looking to the past, but still something that we care very much about. And I just really wanted to draw some attention to what this all means. So if the topic ever comes up again, God help us all, you had a little bit of more information to work with. So moving the traditional income tax filing deadline. Let's start by moving to the next slide. So as everybody has figured out by now, With every big move comes unintended consequences and confusion. And that's part of what I'm going to address here. This year, in March 17th, the IRS announced that the April 15th deadline would move to May 17th. So that is 2 months, 2 months to take action. They announced it in March. The deadline had been April a month later. The deadline moved to May, mid-May, a month after that. It's very little time to get the work done. And that's one of the main things that I want to point out here. Let's move to the next slide. So that created a crisis. And we all know that we like to take advantage of a crisis and make good things come of them. But the tax administrators would tell you we had no crisis here, that this was moving the deadline, creating this extension was something that came from a sector of an industry, but did not come from anywhere else. Let's go to the next slide. Of course, you had the IRS was doing what it could do to publicly say, we don't want to do this, we can't do this. I actually spoke to the incoming administration's transition team on tax in January, and they assured me the administration had no interest in moving the deadline then. The accounting community was not on board with this. Only the AICPA and one sector there had asked for an extension. Software providers, I'll get into more of this in just a moment, those people who create the tax returns that people file online or create all of the tax returns that are filed electronically, they were adamant that moving the extension of deadline was not a good idea. What the accounting community said was that the sector that had asked for an extension of the deadline was that this would help the tax agencies because it would help them stop having backlogs. Lost that word for a minute. And the fact is that backlogs aren't necessarily a bad thing, but we would far rather have the backlog in our building, and then you can make decisions as to whether or not a tax return should be processed first. You can make your priorities. For instance, refund returns tend to be processed first. And you can make decisions on whether or not it's most appropriate to bring in additional help. But if you don't have the returns coming in the door, you can't even make those decisions. So I told you I would tell you just a little bit more about the software provider's position on this. I'm going to quote here from the H&R Block CEO. They put out a very strong blog on this point this spring. And they said, distinguishing between the immediate crisis of 2020 and 2021. That extending the tax deadline seems well-intentioned, but it creates unintended consequences, and these are significant. Proponents, while they were well-intentioned, data and experience both have shown that an extension will bring unintended negative consequences and confusion to many Americans. When deadlines are delayed, basic human nature kicks in, and most people procrastinate. When the filing season was extended last year, IRS data showed that a large number of people delayed filing their taxes. 9.7 million more taxpayers who were due a refund in 2020 waited to file until after April 15th. On the federal side, their average refund was $2,788. So that took close to $30 billion in refunds out of the economy during a critical period of time. Same thing happened this year, although we don't have the data on it yet to know exactly what the volume is. These are all taxpayers who needed and wanted that refund. And yet, because of the basic human nature, they had another month to file. They delayed filing at that point. So instead of extending the filing deadline, what already exists for people who think that something is happening, you've made the decision that we need to take some action, they simply can file for an extension of time to file. And if you're getting a refund, that's it. You basically fill out a name and address, And for a state, many of them, it's automatic. You don't have to fill out anything at all. So you do have that option to decide that, hey, I really think people need to be able to have more time to deal with some sort of crisis. We already have that in place. Next slide. Here's what happens, though, when you change what already exists. The extension of time to file, everybody knows about that. You already have the guidance out on that. The work that goes into making a last-minute change of a deadline is depressingly long and distressingly long. I can't begin to cover it all here. I will just say that, for one, every reference to April 15th has to be changed in code. That's a lot of code changing at the last minute. We're talking about much, much more than just saying, if there's a reference that says you have to file your return by April 15th, you have extension request. All of those references have to be changed. Time of extension to file, they all reference April 15th. You have payroll taxes for household employees. All of those deadlines. Claims for refunds, those deadlines have to change as well. You have to make policy decisions, and these take quite a lot of time because they're the big decisions on estimated payments. You may recall this year, the IRS was adamant that it would not extend the deadline for making estimated payments, because frankly, there was just way too much money involved. And the service and Treasury said that the benefit would flow to the very high-end taxpayers and would not be of any help to those who needed the special help. You have to make a decision exactly which of my deadlines are being extended and which are not. At that point, you have to rewrite all the letters and notices. Many of those, that's coding as well. Taxpayer guidance, I can't tell you how much taxpayers get confused by all this. And you have to train your assisters, but then the phone lines begin to blow up. So next slide. With all of this work, you're left with this question. What work do you want us to delay? What work do you want us not to do? You don't have time to gear up a new budget. They're not getting extra money for this. If you're being honest with yourself when you're making these decisions, or the people who are in charge of these decisions you've got to say, we know that there will be work and deadlines and taxpayer assistance and other coding that is not happening as a result of this. So next slide. And so here's your takeaway. Yes, please don't. I know it's not quite that simple. I know that these decisions are not made in a vacuum, that first off, what happens at the federal government is something that for the most part, you're going to either decide to follow or don't follow. The decision starts there. I wanted to bring this attention to you this year, though, because it has happened for 2 straight years. And we all know that when something becomes normalized, it is far more likely to happen in the future. So whatever you can do now to prepare yourself, your administration, your committees, your tax agency, have discussions with them about what is involved with their state, how difficult this might be. Anything that you might be able to do now to prepare your taxpayers and your PR people, whatever your marketing is for you, so that the taxpayers are not expecting another extension, which again is unnecessary. Things are in place. If you can just calm down the push for this now in the coming year before it starts to become a habit, that's our message to you. And with that, Linda, questions? Carl?
Thank you so much, Verinda. Of course, we can always put, our friends can always put their questions in the chat box and we can take them as we go. But appreciate that perspective. Okay, Carl, you're up.
Yeah, thanks, Linda, and thanks, Linda and Jackson, Jocelyn, and the committee for inviting me to participate. We're going to, if you look at the next slide, we're going to try to unpack a few items here. There's what this slide really shows is just a tremendous acceleration in the amount of federal tax reform that's occurred. I mean, we had this period, 1986 to 2017, a 30-year period when we didn't, there were some federal taxes reform, but not that much. And then, we had a very, very significant bill coming into the Trump administration. And anytime there's significant tax reform, the question always is, do the states conform to it? It could be corporate, could be personal income. Do they conform? Do they conform to particular provisions? Do they have rolling conformity? Do they have fixed date conformity? Do they want to conform? Do they want to delink? And so we've gone through a 3 or 4 year process in some of these major provisions and cut off a little bit by the CARES Act, which rolled back some of the provisions that were in the TCJA, particularly in terms of the timing of the NOL and the interest limit deduction provisions. But a lot of the states didn't necessarily follow that. And all of a sudden, fast forward to 2 plans that came out in April, both about $2 trillion plans, one on corporate income tax and one on personal income tax. So what I'm going to try to do in a limited time frame here is just describe briefly what are the core elements in these plans, which ones do we think are going to have the most impact on the states if enacted, and that if enacted is a gigantic if. We don't know yet what's going to happen. There's a very, very narrow majority, obviously, in the Senate and also in the House for the Democrats. On the other hand, we just saw what happened with the TCJA, which was with fairly narrow, slightly larger, but very narrow majorities on the Republican side in 2017. And with not a single Democratic vote on the Senate side, you did have very sweeping tax reform passed. So it's certainly possible, even in this environment, that we could see something that's very significant, particularly because both of these packages are tied to, both of them are about $2 trillion, but they're tied to, equal amount of spending on the other side for infrastructure and social programs and so forth. And so the other thing that's important here is we can see from the the CARES Act and the other $5 to $6 trillion the federal government spent in the last couple of years. When you look at what the impact of federal tax reform and or federal bills legislation is on the states, you can't just look at what's passed and whether the states automatically conform or not conform to it. You have to look at the fiscal environment. And we really learned that with the pandemic. We had sort of an unprecedented amount of federal spending, about, $500 billion that was noted before, to the states as part of the $5+ trillion. And that changed very much the dynamic of, what the revenue situations were at the states, and reduced significantly in many states the need for additional revenue that would have been there if there hadn't been, federal aid to the states. So again, you have to keep the overall fiscal situation at hand. So turning first to the Made in America tax plan, this is the corporate tax provisions that are on the next slide here. What are the biggest ones, and which ones do we think will affect the states? And so in a lot of ways, this has been described as something that's just a reversal of the Tax Cuts and Job Act. So there was some very large tax cuts in the Tax Cuts and Job Act, both on the corporate side and the personal income side. And certainly part of this would be, and we'll get to the personal income tax side on a little bit later on, but the most important changes here, I think, that could affect the states or the corporate tax changes. And it's interesting because if you put this in historical perspective, if you remember what the federal rate was before all these, the TCJA happened, it was 35%, which was, one of the highest, if not the highest marginal corporate tax rate in the world. That came down to 21%. What the Biden administration is talking about now is not going back to 35%. So those days seem to be gone. It's just going to 28, and already there seems to be some concession, and maybe it'll end up in 25%. Again, we all know that the rates don't matter to the states, right? We don't conform to the changes in the corporate rates. What does matter is the next provision, and we're going to break it out a little bit on a separate slide. It's so important. But if you remember, there was a sea change with the Tax Cuts and Job Act, not just in lowering the corporate tax rate from 35 to 21%, but also in getting rid of a system that had lasted 100 years, which was worldwide taxation on U.S. corporations, so that US corporations were subject to a tax on their worldwide income of their foreign subsidiaries, but it was on a deferred basis. It was when they, had foreign dividends and they repatriated the dividends. Many companies didn't do that over a long period of time. And so most of that money was sitting abroad. And so part of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was to change that and put in this thing we all know called GILTI. And GILTI was really a much more limited tax base, but on a current basis. So some, but not all of the foreign source income of foreign subsidiaries of US multinationals was in the base. But it was taxed on a current basis, which is really important. Now, what's interesting is Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, there was not a single Democratic vote for the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, but this provision, the Democrats didn't like the rates going down, but the GILTI provision is one that they seem to like very much. And in fact, the major proposal within the Biden administration, and I'm going to break this down for you a little bit more on the next slide, but the major provision was to take the GILTI concept, to expand it so it really becomes synonymous with worldwide taxation again, of US companies, but on a current basis. And unlike the current rate, which is around 13.125%, the rate would go up to 21%. So this is by far the most important change that would occur within the corporate tax reform. And it's one that, as we'll see from the map in a moment, about a third or more of the states have conformed to some degree, 5% to 50%, with these GILTI provisions. The question is, would they stay that way? Would more states join them? And so we're going to break that one down because it's so important. But just quickly, there's also a 15% minimum tax. So this one is different than the global tax, which is really more focused on foreign source income earned by US companies. This one is more for companies that, for whatever reason, could be losses, could be lots of expenses and deductions and investments and deductions, but for whatever reason, they don't pay federal taxes, even though they have book income for accounting purposes. This would put in a minimum tax so that everyone who had book income would have to pay at least 15% on it. Don't know where any of these will go. Don't know where that one will go. Probably wouldn't affect the states because minimum taxes don't typically get conformed. And then there's a bunch of other changes going on. Anti-inversion rules getting made it tougher, so US companies can't change to be foreign because that's going to be really important. More preferences now for solar and renewable and not for fossil fuels. Elimination of this FDII thing, which was a sort of incentive to keep your income here, and they want to change it. But a lot of different changes going on. But I want to turn to the next chart, which is really, really important, I think, for the states to understand. If you look at the next slide, and this is how GILTI would change, because this has been such a major topic of debate. How should the federal government tax the worldwide income of US companies? Should they tax it at all? If so, how, at what rate? And then should the states do the same? Because historically, a minority of states, about a third of the states taxed a part of the foreign dividends, which the federal government taxed 100% of, but there often was not a lot of money from that because it was a deferred tax. And if the dividend didn't come home, you never got it. GILTI is changing that. So if you look at the top line here, that's the TCJA's GILTI, and the bottom line is the Biden one. So the key concept here is both of them are on a current basis. There's no more we'll tax the income earned by US multinationals, foreign subsidiaries, only when they dividended it. That concept is pretty much gone. Now it's on a current basis. The question is at what rate and what's the base? And so you can see right here, the Biden proposal is to change the rate to 21%, a huge increase in the rate. The tax-based determination, there's a deduction in there now. Really, if you've got a lot of physical investment, capital investments abroad in factories and so forth, you get to multiply that times 10% and you get a deduction, so-called QBI deduction. That would be gone. So basically now you're talking about a worldwide tax on all of the income of your foreign subsidiaries on a current basis at 21%. And then there's some sort of other changes in there. So that's the most significant change that would occur. It's going to be hotly contested. We don't know what's going to happen with this. We don't have any language on any of the different proposals that have come out. We sort of know the general contours of them, but there's no legislative language. So let's just think about that. How would that affect the states? Because as I said before, and if you go to the next map, you can sort of see it. Here's a map of what happened over the last 3 or 4 years. All of the states that are in the light blue did not conform to the GILTI provision. All of the ones that did not conform are not taxing any foreign source income generally, or a very de minimis amount of it. The states that are in sort of the darker blue colors, a lot of them in the Northeast or up in the mountain ranges, the Rockies, they conform to varying amounts, 5% to 50%. So they're saying we want to tax some foreign source income, but perhaps less than the federal government's doing. And then there's 3 states, and California being the most important one of them, since it's so large, that are sort of reconsidering this issue right now and have legislation that's gone through this year to decide, do we want to tax more foreign source income? And so what's interesting here, and the backdrop for this is not just what the federal government's doing, the whole international community, 137 countries are participating in a project with the OECD, the big international organization. They've been doing so for years, and they're having a critical meeting this summer where they may come up with something that looks like GILTI as well, and back a global minimum tax on their, and again, these global minimum taxes can only be on a country's own foreign multinationals. You can't impose a global minimum tax on somebody else's foreign multinationals, which is a very important point here. So how might the states react if the Biden administration proposal goes through? Based on estimates from Treasury Department and Joint Committee Taxation, if the Biden proposal goes through, it would essentially end profit shifting. So all of this talk over the last 20 years about companies moving things around or moving to the Cayman Islands or whatever, it would be gone. And for a lot of states, for public policy, people would say that's a good thing. We don't like this kind of tax planning or whatever. The flip side of that, though, is that the day that proposal passes, if the Biden administration proposal passes, the discussion would shift from profit shifting to tax rate competition between U.S. multinationals and others, because something like GILTI can only be imposed on your own companies. And right now, the Biden proposal to tax GILTI at 21%, really all worldwide taxation, is a much higher rate than the rest of the world is considering, which is more like 12.5, maybe 15%. If you put the state rate on top of the 21%, so you get up to maybe 26% or whatever of state taxes GILTI as well, you would have U.S. multinationals at a 5 or 10 point differential, paying more on their foreign earnings than their competitors from China or Germany or Japan or whatever. That would immediately become a big issue. So if you're thinking about this from the state's point of view, you might say, well, the federal government's going to tax more foreign source income. Germany might do it. France might do it. All these countries might do it. Why shouldn't we do it? So that may be one way of looking at it if these changes happen. But the other way of looking at it is that the US government, if it does this, could actually crowd the states out completely, because if the federal government raises the rate to 21, or even if it goes up to 15 or 18%, basically you're saying, I don't care if you're a US company and you have foreign subsidiaries, I don't care where you earn your money anywhere in the world. They want to tax it at 0 or 5 or 10 or 15. I don't care. I'm going to take the rest. I'm going to take it up to 15 or 18 or 21. That effectively does end profit shifting. The problem is if the other countries only set a rate at 12 or 15 and the US rate is 4, 5, 6, 8 points higher, US companies are going to be at a disadvantage. And then if a state comes in on top of that, and California is considering language now, or legislative proposal under Assembly Bill 71, which would expand the taxation of tax and GILTI, which they currently don't do now, to 50%, and they wouldn't allow any apportionment factors, foreign factors to it. If that was to pass and the Biden thing passed, then all of a sudden US companies would be, it may be a 10 percentage point, would pay 10 percentage points more on their foreign income than their competitors, which would be a serious problem for the US. So I think the important thing here is we don't know what's going to happen. A lot of people think, though, that this particular part of Biden's proposals, or at least some compromise version, has more of a chance than maybe some of the rate changes or others. If it happened, it would probably take effect for 2022. And the question for the states, both the ones that are currently taxing GILTI and the ones that might think of taxing GILTI, is if it changes, one, as the world shifted so much so that the original reason for a state to tax foreign source income, that maybe some of it was domestic or was getting shifted out of the US, if that reason's gone, than what's left. And what's left is, imposing, getting more corporate income taxes. But again, you can only get them from US multinationals. You can't impose this on any foreign multinationals. So it puts states, I think, in a particular bind that it's going to be very hard for them to tax foreign source income if the federal government sort of crowds out the field and has a rate that's equal or higher than the rest of the world. So this one really bears watching. It's a huge issue. And if you think about it, it's really a return to residence-based taxing, which we had for the last 100 years at the federal level, except at the federal level, it was always on a deferred basis, only tax foreign source income when it actually gets dividended, which is more under the control of companies. This is not under the control of companies. It's going to be on a current basis. It's a much better mousetrap if you want to look at it that way. It's raised huge concerns, for U.S. businesses, because if the rate's higher than what the international rate is set at, assuming the international community agrees to a rate, it could put U.S. companies at a disadvantage. Just want to go to the last slide and just quickly go over if $2 trillion of corporate tax increases, weren't enough, then there's another 1.5 to 2 trillion of personal income tax changes, some estate tax changes, and payroll tax changes. And so the most important ones here is, a lot of this is just a rollback of the TCJA. And this is not that unusual between Democratic and Republican administrations over the last 50 years. There'll be tax cuts on the Republican side, and the rates will go right back up. Like, the top marginal rate would go back up to, 39.6% federally. Again, most of this doesn't affect the states in the sense that the states don't follow the rate changes. It may affect the debates on progressive income taxes and other things. So conceptually, a lot of these things, even if the states don't conform to them, can still affect the states, but they don't directly affect you in terms of direct conformity. But there are a couple things to keep in mind. One of the ones here is the capital gains rate. I mean, right now the capital gains rate has been a preferred rate. If you are very wealthy and you pay, a top federal tax of 37 or 40%, your capital gain rate is only about 20 or 23%. That would change. And for people who earn over $1 million, that would go all the way up to 43%. Again, that might be something if it happens. We don't know if anything has happened, but if it happened, states are having some of those same debates. Should we tax our our high income households more? Again, that could cut both ways. It could be a green light in the sense that, well, the federal government did it, we should do it. Or it could be, well, wait a minute. California has like a 13.3% rate already, for instance. If the federal government rate goes to 43%, now we're talking mid-50s for somebody selling stocks or bonds or a house or something. Is that too much? So again, what's very interesting about this package is that the federal changes don't necessarily mean the states will follow, because they could actually crowd out the states and make there less room for them to have similar provisions. The other one that I'm sure you're all interested on this is the SALT deduction. So there's large elements within the liberal part of the Democratic Party, particularly the ones from the blue states along the coast, that want to go back to the old system. So you don't have a $10,000 cap on state and local tax deductions. That was one of the major provisions in the Tax Cuts and Job Act. That one so far doesn't have President Biden's support. That one would cost, $500 billion, $750 billion or more, depending on how you do it. So it would be very hard for them to, I think, do it as part of this package, because they'd have to come up with those funds or deficit fund it. We'll have to keep an eye on what happens, but that's one that's been very, very important to a lot of the states, particularly the ones that are higher income and higher income tax or property tax. So that bears waiting. So that's, where we are. I don't know that we'll know a lot more until the summer. I mean, if this happens, it probably will happen under reconciliation almost for sure, and probably happen this year, because I think everyone's learned the lesson from 2017. If you're going to do anything big, do it early on when you still have a majority, even if it's a bare majority, and don't wait. So we're going to know there is some interaction, especially on the foreign source income part of this, with the OECD. The US is actively encouraging now under the Biden administration. They didn't under the Trump administration, for the OECD both to set a global minimum tax on the foreign earnings of every country's foreign multinationals. And they're actively involved in the sort of the digital part of the OECD's project, which is to change the rules so that it's easier for all countries to tax digital companies under the income tax. we don't know where that's going to go, but there's going to be some big moments on that in the summer and in the fall. So that remains to be seen. So a lot going on internationally at the federal level. And this is all, or a lot of it's going to have an impact on the state. So we'll have to kind of wait and see and unpack it as it goes along. Be glad to answer any questions about all of the above.
Okay, thank you, Carl. I don't see any questions now, but of course, our members are free to put questions in the chat box throughout the presentations. And I think we're just going to take a few minute break here. In fact, let's reconvene maybe at 10 after the hour, if that's okay. And then we'll get started with the Tax Foundation. Okay, see you all in about 4 minutes.
And it's the first time I've had curly hair, maybe ever. So I'm different than usual. But let me get started. So why so much taxation? Why so much attention to the taxation of data? Definitely a hot topic among the states. I say one aspect of it is that, I mean, the giants of social media now are getting so much attention, and they're proving to be perhaps one of the greatest public policy issues of the next decade or so to deal with them. But they also happen to be extraordinarily profitable. They're not very well liked these days, and so there's an interest in among the states in taxing them. I think I would add a few more reasons. There's a sense that they're probably not being taxed appropriately now. It's hard to know without getting the records from tax departments, but if they're not paying a lot of federal tax overseas, they may not be paying a lot of tax on their corporate income tax. And so that there's an issue where there's a sense that they could contribute more, particularly considering they're so profitable. Another aspect is that there's a certain feeling of injustice that they're getting so much of their assets free from consumers, and turns out that that's their greatest asset, makes them super profitable. It's also turning out to make them very, very powerful, and the consumers don't benefit in any way. They do obviously get Google service on something, but there's a sense that justice is not being served. So the focus of that has been on, of the states has been on using a grocery receipts tax on digital advertising to get money from these giants. It's a narrower base and a narrower concept than the taxation of data more generally, and I'll get into that a little further on. But there are reasons why this was thought to be a good base. People are familiar with the grocery receipts tax. It's not easy to get around. So it makes sense. And you can create a high threshold, and you can leave most of the people that you want to leave out behind and wind up taxing only companies at the very high end. So that's what Maryland did. Maryland has been the first one to not only propose a tax, but pass a tax and then override the veto of the governor who vetoed it. So almost immediately, the tax has been challenged in court by any number of associations. There are legal scholars, including, well, I won't say I'm a legal scholar, but I have my concern that the tax violates the Internet Tax Freedom Act. The Internet Tax Freedom Act says that you can't tax a digital product differently, certainly worse than you tax whatever you want to call it, a real world product. And so here there's a tax that's only on digital advertising, and the argument would be, well, what about newspaper ads and what about television ads? And I think that's a valid argument, maybe even a winning argument. There are scholars on the who have a different opinion that say you can make a strong argument that there's really no equivalent to digital advertising. Another argument is that digital advertising has caused a whole slew of problems that print advertising never caused, and it's appropriate to single out an industry for increased taxation if they've created additional costs for the state. And I think that's an interesting argument. I think it's interesting that the folks who sued the companies went to federal court and sued, where they really don't have standing. So to make the argument that they did have standing, they suggested that what was happening to them was a penalty, not a tax. And in a way, I think by doing that, they may have played into the argument that, okay, let's say it's a penalty and you're being asked to pay extra because of the dislocation that social media has caused. And there's plenty of that. So that's interesting. There was a New York case which bears on that involving opioids, where New York wanted to run a $100 million program. It just told 8 or 10 folks that were in the opioid industry, well, we need $100 million and we're going to collect this from you based on market share. And the state was sued, and the state was upheld in the Second Circuit Court of Appeals. So I'm not sure exactly if that bears on it, but I think it's interesting that states may be able to isolate an industry that is having ramifications that's costing the state money and impose a tax and collect based on market share or some other way of differentiating who pays what. So I think Jared is going to talk much more about grocery receipts on advertising. So I work for Senator Krueger, and we decided to try to go about things a different way. Senator Krueger is the chair of the Senate Finance Committee. She and I spoke in the spring. The conversation went pretty much, the pandemic is killing New York. We're draining, bleeding revenues. there are all sorts of industries that are suffering, and then there are some that are thriving. And Google and Amazon and Facebook did incredibly well and are still doing incredibly well during the pandemic. The note and her feeling was, is there a way to get at the ones who are doing well and kind of leaving alone the ones who aren't doing well? And then we had a second part of the conversation was, and it galls her that these companies get so much of this consumer data for free and the consumers don't get a piece of the action, let's say. So we were looking to do something that responded to both those concerns. And it turned out to be a very specific tax on data. So different from tax on digital advertising, this is actually a tax on data, and it's imposed on companies that collect data from not only consumers, but other sources, but about, and in this case, New York consumers. And I like to think of it a little bit like a severance tax. Severance tax, you're taking oil out of the ground in Oklahoma, and Oklahoma is going to make you pay for that. And in a way, what we're arguing here is that we have all this consumer information that belongs to New Yorkers, and in that sense, belongs to the state of New York. And if you're going to make use of it and take it and put it into a business activity, well, then you can pay for it. So that's definitely, you know, novel territory that we've gotten to. But so the tax works that the baseline numbers, you have to have more than 1 million customers you collect data from, let's say consumers, you collect data from every month. Now these numbers pertain to New York. Basically, our population is about 20 million. So that will knock out a lot of companies. If you're collecting data from more than 1 million, you're going to be in, and let's just take as an example somebody like Google. Google, which might be the top of the heap, we have 20 million people in New York, they might have 15 million accounts. That's a lot of accounts. And so now, based on whatever rate schedule you're going to put in, they're going to pay some amount of money. And so at first we kind of looked, well, what would $10 for a year's worth of a consumer's data? That sounds pretty inexpensive. That doesn't seem like too much to ask. Well, at $10, Google might have been paying $150 million a year in New York, because if you have 15 million people you're getting data about and charging them each $10 a year, that's probably too much money. So it was interesting that, so you could charge a very small amount for a whole year's use of a New York consumer's data, and it still amounted to a fair amount of tax. So we backed in a rate schedule that obviously is open to negotiation, and but we backed it in so that basically the highest rate you could pay was about $4 a year. $4 a year turned out to be $59 million, let's say, for the biggest company. Again, that's a lot of money, but if you look at it from the other end, well, it's just, that seems fair, $4 a year. So that's where it stands. New York had no intention of actually introducing it this year. It came pretty late in the budget season. The federal money came in, so it hasn't really been tested. It did get a letter of opposition from cost. Nothing I would say that was fatal. The cost did not even suggest that it was unconstitutional or violated ITFA. So from drafters' point of view, that was positive. And so far, all the action has been with the grocery receipts tax, but it's pretty clear now that if you're going to impose a grocery receipts tax, you're going to be waiting 5 years to find out whether it flies or not. I was involved in a tax involving Amazon filed April 2008 and finally got a decision December 2013. I would expect it to be something like that. So states should know that if they're hoping for money anytime soon, that's obviously one problem with gross receipts tax, and whatever odds you get it, they could be close to 50-50 or more that the state of Maryland will lose. So I'll turn it over to Jared.
Thank you, Rob, and thanks everyone on the call. I appreciate the opportunity to talk with some people about this. I think it's a really important issue, and I do want to discuss in a little more length some of the taxes that Rob wasn't talking about, and that's not really in response to him, because as he says, his focus legislatively really is just the data tax, but the panel is sort of about digital taxes more broadly, so I want to bring them in. He did talk a little about the digital advertising tax approach, but there are basically three different types that are being considered in the states right now. One is, as he said, the digital advertising tax. It's on the gross revenues from digital advertising in a state, sometimes with tax rates that are based on global platform revenues, not the in-state activity. That was the Maryland model. It's been adopted in most of the legislation that's been copied since, but not all. There's also a social media tax idea. This is essentially the same concept as the digital advertising tax, but it applies to a narrower base of payers. It's just social media companies and not all advertisers, but with an added twist that often there is a per account fee, sort of in the same way that Rob was talking about on the data tax. In this case, it's maybe $1 per social media account registered to someone in the state. One obvious proviso is that right now, most social media companies don't know your address. They might have IP addresses associated with your use, but that's not something that is necessarily on file. There are a lot of anonymous accounts on social media at this time. And then the final form is a data tax, which can either be essentially a gross receipts tax on the sale. Washington State's looking at something like that, or something on the possession of data. And there's two models. There's something like what New York is looking at, where it's per individual. It's basically the customer, and it's the same amount regardless of how much data you have. Or there's the intangible property tax approach, which West Virginia looked at last year and quickly abandoned, where you'd be valuing the data. So I want to speak to all of these for at least a few minutes and discuss some of the considerations behind them. I think the first thing to acknowledge, this is especially true with the rationales for the digital advertising taxes, but it applies to all of these, is there's not a loophole. I think that was something that a lot of policymakers believed initially because they looked to Europe. They saw digital services taxes being adopted in Europe. Of course, in international tax regimes, we don't have economic nexus. We don't have market sourcing. So the various digital business models had a unique situation where they could be selling into a state that have customers in a country, but they don't have physical presence, or I guess as you would call it on the international level, you'd be speaking of permanent establishment rules. So there'd be no taxability. That's, of course, not how it works at the state level. States use apportionment. Most states are at this point moving very rapidly towards single sales factor. So where the sale takes place is what matters. And a lot of states use market sourcing of services. So they're saying that the sale of services is sourced to where the benefits received or where the market is for that. States are, of course, free to do that if they don't already. So what's really important to note here is, one, digital advertising, digital services more broadly, they are being captured by state corporate income taxes. They weren't necessarily being taxed at the European country level. They are being taxed here. And two, if states feel, well, we're not getting it where we are, where the services are, the company's not here, you can go single sales factor, or if you're already there or highly weighted sales, you can adopt market sourcing and attack both of those things within the existing tax structure. Rob mentioned thinking of this as a severance tax. I would briefly note that severance taxes, as we currently have them, they involve the extraction of scarce resources, usually non-renewable, but at least things that take time to replace. The idea is depletion. And states are often also on the hook for things like environmental remediation, reclamation. When oil is extracted, there's a loss. There are economic benefits that can't be enjoyed by a future generation. None of this is really true with data. Even a royalties model doesn't really work. There was a data dividend idea in some states at some point that you'd pay for this, you'd give it to individuals. We're not really seeing that in these proposals right now. So yeah, I think that there's just a real difference in that. There's, in my mind, also no justification for a targeted tax. Taxes, again, should be on broad basis with low rates. Digital services are already taxed, like I said, under existing corporate taxes. There's some competing rationales for this targeting. I think beyond that notion that maybe it was untaxed, which again, it's not. One of them has been that tech companies are just earning a lot of money and we should tax them extra because of that success. I don't think that's a good model to just look at which companies, which industry is doing well right now and build additional supplementary taxes on top of them. Some of it is that targeted advertising is undesirable and should be penalized. But again, note this doesn't actually cover targeted advertising. It hits all advertising or all data. Then there's the punitive aspect of this. And you see this on both the left and the right. Punitive taxation due to maybe a big distaste for big technology. That's more on the left. Or opposition to content moderation policies, which has been more on the right. In both cases, I don't think that's a path that we really want to go down. Policymakers do put a thumb on the scale with business incentives, but it's really a different thing altogether to design taxes to penalize particular industries or business models because of their real or perceived support or opposition to political causes or how they run their businesses. I feel like a Republican criticism of some of the Democratic proposals and motivations would be that it's inappropriate to use the tax code as a cudgel against disfavored businesses. And the Democratic criticism of some of the Republican proposals would be exactly the same. They're just different, different rationales behind what's disliked. So, this is a non-neutral and non-transparent tax. Those bearing the costs, advertisers, many of them local, as well as in-state consumers, have those costs hidden from them. Ultimately, we're taxing a business input and the burden is fundamentally in-state. There was a study of the French digital advertising tax. It concluded that 55% of advertising costs would ultimately be passed along to consumers. And that's not even counting the costs borne by the businesses themselves. Now, advertising costs are dynamic. Even if the bill theoretically prohibits an add-on charge to cover digital advertising taxes, the prices will reflect those taxes. And those advertising in state, which will mostly be in-state businesses, are going to bear those costs, as well as, in some cases, the consumers. I'm going to briefly touch on both legal and administrative issues for all of three of these taxes at once, if I can. Firstly, especially with the digital advertising tax, but I don't think limited to it, there is, as Rob notes, the Permanent Internet Tax Freedom Act, which prohibits imposing discriminatory taxes on electronic commerce. Electronic commerce is defined as transactions conducted on the internet or through internet access, its sale, its offer, its delivery of goods or services, or information important on the data side, whether or not for consideration. And discrimination means that it's not a tax that's generally imposed and legally collectible on transactions involving similar services accomplished through other means. So a tax just on the digital, just on the data, not on other things. There's also a dormant commerce clause challenge, at least for some types. So if you've got a Maryland style bill, the external consistency test comes into play, where you're using activity outside of the state, you're using maybe global revenues to set the rates. That's clearly a problem. There's something else that Richard Pomp has raised, that I think is really significant here, that, even if we're not doing that, there's a lack of specificity in a lot of these, in the definitions, and I'll get into that on the administrative side. But this creates due process violations, which can make the bills void for vagueness. And there's an internal consistency element of this. Internal consistency rule basically says that if every state adopted the same provision, it would not result in double taxation. But if every state adopted the same bill and all of the administrative decisions are up to someone outside the legislature, there's no methodology, and I'll get into that, then even adopting the same system could yield radically different results. The external consistency is, again, the idea that we are using, that we're using outside exogenous factors. So let's think, why is this so tough? What are the challenges? Well, one, it's incredibly difficult to determine exactly when advertising is served in a state. What if it's blocked by an ad blocker? How effective is IP tracing, the geofencing really? The answer is often not very. The apportionment formulas functionally don't work. Maryland has an apportionment formula that says that they use the percentage of US gross revenue that's attributable to Maryland, then multiplied by all US gross revenue. And you might have caught that that's a fraction multiplied by the denominator, that just yields where you started from. It's not doing anything. It's just that policymakers were told, hey, this isn't fairly apportioned. So they put in language that apportions it by just saying you find a definition. We don't even know what defines advertising. And there's been some subsequent legislation in Maryland to try to address this, but is voice over IP, telephony, is that digital advertising? Sponsored content, the streaming of a terrestrial broadcast that includes advertising that was purchased for over the airwaves, email newsletters, lots of things can be captured in this. And Maryland's trying to define some of that now, but these are really tough. Data taxes, like what New York had, would be imposed on the possession of consumer data, the notions the company should have to pay for information on their residents. Again, there's been proposals to do this on a property tax side, and then you have to somehow determine what the value of that is. As Rob mentioned, Senator Kruger's proposal is just to go with basically the number of people that they have information on. What's notable here is that information is basically anything. A company that simply has a name and address is taxed in the same way as a company that has all of your, socioeconomic information. It has your browsing history. It has, your purchase history. Doesn't matter. It's just, it's basically per person. In the same way, some of the social media taxes impose not only on advertising revenue, but also on in-state accounts, where social media networks would be required, I guess, to have a full name and address of account holders if this were to work. It's unclear if they'd be required to shut down existing accounts of someone who wouldn't provide that. If they did it based on IPs, that's already imperfect. It's complicated by travel. What if someone's regularly checking their social media account at both work and home in different states? There are a lot of challenges associated with trying to do this, many of which raise serious legal issues. And there are consequences for the consumer. Consumers might well pay more, not just because some businesses might pass along a share of the advertising costs, but also because such taxes could change their own access to online services. If an advertising supported model is less profitable, then more of the internet might go behind a paywall. And would people really be better off if it became too expensive or too much of a hassle for retailers to offer loyalty cards, which have data, of course, associated with them on the consumer's purchasing, or member perks? These things could theoretically go away, or at least have a few dollars per account holder associated with them. If social media companies are taxed on both their revenue generating ads and per account, you could see restrictions on account creation or subscription fees for some types of services. And even if that doesn't happen because the legacy players just don't want to change that model, innovation in the space might be reduced if the model becomes less profitable. So above and beyond all of the legal and practical concerns, which I think there are many more besides, there's really this fundamental question. And I think that question's just why? Why are we taxing this industry and this activity in particular, given that it's already subject to general taxes? It's covered by the corporate income tax. It's covered by all of the other normal range of taxes that businesses pay. What purpose is served? And you've heard, the argument, well, there's money there. It's an argument, obviously, that policymakers often use, but we want to be, I think, very careful about saying we've got our general business taxes, our general taxes, and then we're going to pick one industry at a time based on they're doing well and start taxing them. Or there's the argument that they are disliked in some ways, and that dislike can run across partisan beliefs. You see opposition on the right, more the populist right, about what social media companies are and aren't allowing to be written. You see maybe opposition on the left on the sort of really big companies that have a lot of control. Maybe there's overlap there, maybe those are intention, but you see this idea that we should use the tax code to go after particular companies because of their business model. And that strikes me as regulatory policy, not tax policy. If there is a discernible harm that needs to be addressed, and I'm not an expert on whether a state should try to address some of these things. I'd be skeptical probably of whether they should be, but that's a regulatory solution. It is not something where you just say, well, let's tax them more. There's not an externality that we're trying to internalize. It's not, like we have with some excise taxes. It's not a user pays system. It's just, we don't care for this industry, so let's penalize them or encourage them to do something else. So policymakers should ask themselves not only whether the proposal is practical, not only whether it's legal. And again, the Permanent Internet Tax Freedom Act is going to be a pretty significant bar to most of these proposals, and the Dormant Commerce Clause is going to be a potential impediment as well, but also whether it's justified. We know, of course, that at the international level, the Biden administration is fighting digital services taxes. They are arguing that they are inappropriate, and those ones are theoretically much more temporary. Most of the countries that have introduced them have said that once the OECD Pillar 1 negotiations are complete and there's a framework for dealing with problems that do exist at the international level that don't exist at the state level, that they plan to eliminate those taxes. And still, the US government's position is that these taxes are impermissible at this time. We're fighting them. But at the same time, we're complicating that analysis by states doing this even though the activity is already subject to tax, unlike at the international level in some cases. So I think that we need to think very carefully about what we're trying to accomplish with this tax, whether it accomplishes any of those aims, and who ultimately pays. Because yes, it is going to be at one level, the Googles and the Facebooks and others of the world who remit the tax. It's imposed on platforms. But how much of that will be borne by either in-state businesses that are advertising to individuals in the state, or by the consumers themselves? And of course, that's going to depend on different elasticities. How much can be passed along? It's very reasonable to assume much of it will be borne by the business. It's going to be more, there's going to be more analysis on how much of it goes to the consumer themselves. But again, sort of the question of why, because at the end of the day, you might think you're taxing Google, but to some extent, you're taxing the restaurant that wants to advertise that they have reopened the dining room and are ready to welcome you back. So I think that policymakers need to think very carefully, do they want this legal fight, and why are they doing this in the first place?
Do we still have a little time?
Yeah, Rob, why don't you go ahead and have anything to add, and then we can.
Or you want
questions?
Should we take questions?
I'd say first, if you have anything to add, yeah, but yeah, we can also take questions. So it's like there's one for you in the chat box.
Sure, yeah.
So don't people giving their data to these companies get something in return, like a free search engine, free streaming music, free video games? How do you justify the view that they get nothing under the data tax?
No, I think that's true that they do get benefits. And depending on how you measure it, if somebody took your Google away, you'd probably be willing to pay a fair amount of money for it. On the other hand, what it costs Google to add one more customer is quite low. But I still think that it's a combination of intrusiveness, that they're getting your personal information. You don't know how much of it they're getting, but it's more than you think, and you don't know exactly where it's coming from, and it's more than you'd like, but it's yours, and it has monetary value. And the question is, should state help New York consumers monetize that value? I don't think we would give the money directly back to the consumers if it's not much money, if it's $4 or $8, but if it turns out to be a significantly higher number, the money be sent right back to consumers. So I think there is an argument that, and partly again, it's when you have these super successful companies, they're going to be an obvious target. I think it's easy to say, well, why them? I think the fact that they have a boatload of money is not an answer you should slough off. When it was April and the money was bleeding and you had to look someplace for money, and you're not looking to hurt those who are already suffering, that's one reason to pick out a specific business in a specific industry and get some money from them.
If I could respond to that briefly, I guess I'd say a few things. One, even if I as a consumer don't like how much maybe a leading search engine has on me, because I imagine it knows everything about my life, I'm not sure that I have been helped, or my situation has improved in any ways, knowing that the state of New York got $4 out of them, or $8, or whatever it may be. If I actually have a serious objection to it, that is not remediated by the $4 going to the state. And if it's significantly more than that, if you're positing it's going to be a very large number at some point, that could be enough to actually write checks to people, bearing in mind that typically for states, there's not even any residual to send if it's not more than $10, because it costs money to process. Now, mean, maybe the biggest search engines can pay that, but there are an awful lot of companies that have data on a wide number of consumers. Supermarket chains are among them. A lot of sellers that aren't going to be your biggest technology companies. How much do we want to charge them for a customer, or how much do we want to limit their ability to have even something as simple as an address? I mean, if it's going to cost $10, $20 to have a consumer's address, that becomes very prohibitive for companies large enough to reach these thresholds. At 4 even, that's an awful lot, I think, or even at some of the lower levels. And then just, more broadly, okay, they have money and we need it. New York, of course, ended up having revenue flatline over the last year. Many states had revenues mildly up. New York is also, I think, receiving $15 billion in federal aid through the fiscal relief funds that are available, and that's not counting the local aid. So I guess this is a very big step, talking about like an excise tax on something as broad as data. Or in other states talking about a tax on digital advertising that very likely runs afoul of the Permanent Internet Tax Freedom Act. I think there was this idea maybe back a year ago that, wow, we're going to try really bold things because we're in crisis. And that's not really where things are right now. And I'm wondering why we are potentially doing something that honestly potentially shuts people off from a lot of things that have been very valuable during the pandemic. Yeah, maybe the biggest search engine still runs with all of this, but there are other services people get online that they're very happy to receive that are ad supported. And I don't know that they would be better off if it was not economical to provide those in a state anymore.
I'll just make a quick comment that I think in terms of where the burden of the tax goes, one of the things that I thought was attractive is that some portion of it is going to be borne by New York consumers, but if it's borne by consumers more generally, then New York has exported its, the burden to consumers in other states, to the extent that it's advertisers in other states, to the extent that it's, the big companies themselves. You have a tax where if you're collecting whatever, $700 million, it's not like a $700 million sales tax increase. You're probably imposing less of it on your consumers than if you did some more straightforward sales tax law. And so, I mean, that's not the reason it's done necessarily, but I think there is an argument that in this particular case, there would be the benefit of some exporting of the tax liability. I know states, they love to tax rental cars at airports high, and that's because everybody who does it's going to be out of state. If you started to look closely at who might bear the burden of the data tax that we've created, it might well be that a pretty good chunk of it is not New York consumers.
So we have a clarification question for you as well, Rob. Isn't basic customer contact information excluded from this tax? Also, isn't there a significant threshold that would limit this to the biggest of the big?
The law does not, if you only collect contact information, you're not subject to the tax. If you only collect information which is then aggregated, stripped of its, the personal identification, that's also not subject to the tax. I forgot the next thing you asked about.
Isn't there a significant threshold that would limit this to the?
Yes. In New York, we made it 1 million subscribers. Again, that's a number that should probably float based on your population. Hopefully that would knock out supermarket chains and some of the businesses you mentioned. So we have taken attempts to take care of what we see as problems that would create unfairness or complications of one kind or another.
In practice, I would just note, though, that it's unlikely that someone would have an address and not also a purchasing history. And I didn't see anything in the bill where if part of your data is literally what they bought from you, that wouldn't trigger the tax.
No, it would.
Yeah, so there aren't a whole lot of situations where you have addresses of customers but don't know what the customers ordered at that address.
And then one more, is there a risk that providers will convert to a charge model, leaving those with lower income unable to access the services that are free today?
Well, it's really pretty hard to believe that, although it's possible, is Google going to start charging New Yorkers, since we're the only ones doing it, if it happened, and it hasn't happened, and the fiscal situation is better, but are they going to change their business model over a relatively modest tax? And I think the likelihood is not. If they wanted to somehow punish New York for doing this, then conceivably they could figure out some way to impose something. But if you're not charging anything and you're not sending a bill, and you have this mechanism set up that works pretty well both ways, whether you're going to change it for a small amount of money, I think is pretty highly unlikely.
I would add, though, that there are a lot of people who can be affected by this that aren't a search engine, and they do have accounts, of course, but a lot of streaming services, some of them are free and ad supported. Some of them have a fee associated with them, but are also partially ad supported, and they're different tiers. You could, I think, very much see some of the free services become premium services, or the hybrid services that might have some ads and some fee, have that fee go up. So it'd be in the same way with anything else where there's subscription content, where you end up potentially paywalling more of the internet or increasing the costs, because if it's going to be more expensive and there's less profitability associated with advertising supported or free services, or you've got to offset a charge for having account data on someone, eventually you've got to pass that along. And there are a lot of services that are free right now. The revenue associated with each account is probably only a few dollars a year, and if you're suddenly charging a few dollars a year, it doesn't make sense to provide that service anymore. So I think we need to think more than just, will the world's largest search engine blacklist New York, and what about everything else we receive online? Because yeah, 1 million people's a lot, but New York's a big state, and it's not just a search engine or one social media company that's going to have 1 million accounts or 1 million customers in New York. 1 in 5, 1 in 20 people.
It's never easy to find a tax to impose. Some of the arguments that you make about this tax are made about almost every tax. You're taxing a business input, which real property tax, I think, often does that. The difference in price is going to hurt consumers. The difference in price is going to mean that Google can't provide the quality of content that it once provided. When you're doing tax policy for the states, you sort of have to separate the wheat from the chaff, and you make a calculated risk, I guess, whenever you impose tax, but there's a pretty long history of business overstating the damage that's going to be done, and life goes on.
I would just comment that generally speaking, we do talk about broad bases and low rates. There are a lot of general taxes. So yeah, I mean, every tax has an impact on business and individual choices, and we care about those, and we care about the distinctions, because every tax is different in what it's targeting. So we have a corporate income tax in most states, of course, and it's on net profits. This is targeting an activity, and it's very narrow in scope. It's saying, let's go after, depending on the design, companies with lots of consumer data, or that's the bill you're talking about, or let's go after large digital advertising, or let's go after social media, and then have them figure out how in the world to determine how many accounts are in the state, which is going to be, I think, a huge issue and a privacy issue. There's privacy issues associated with a few of these things, which is a little ironic, and sometimes they've been talked about addressing the privacy issues associated with big tech, but they might require unmasking the privacy that individual account holders already have in the cases of social media in particular, recognizing that's not the tax that Rob is primarily talking about. So I think the burden of proof is higher when we're talking about creating some very new types of tax in an area where we already have multiple levels of tax that are applying to all these businesses. There's not a loophole that they're exploiting where this is some unique activity that somehow doesn't become subject to state tax codes.
So would you have been kinder if we had increased the corporate income tax rate by 3 or 4%? Would that have gotten less criticism because that's about the trade-off in terms of dollars.
I think that indicates just how large of a tax you're suggesting and how significant this is, that it would be, a 4% increase on a corporate income tax that raises some of the most money in any state in the country, both, effective rate and everything else, because New York, I think Cost has a study that says that, all taxes on business, not just corporate income tax, is about $10,500 per job in New York. And that's the highest of any state other than just like the pure oil states. It's about 6,500 on average. So yeah, I mean, a 4% increase, I would say I would have some huge concerns about that because it's economically damaging. But I think that's just, this is a new type of tax. We're talking about creating an entirely different type of tax and imposing those on top of the taxes that already exist. I think you need a strong justification for why new taxes like this should be created on one industry. And the fact that, you're talking like 50% of your corporate income tax burden functionally being imposed, rough math, but being imposed on targeted industries through a new excise tax, that is a really big thing to be talking about here.
Okay, going back, just the initial conversation with the senator was, we're trying to hit companies that are doing well and not touch everybody who's not doing well. Obviously, a broad-based corporate income tax would hit a lot of businesses that weren't doing well. And then there is this sense of rough justice, which you can disagree with, that folks are getting something in return for, all this personal data you're giving. But some folks definitely see it the other way, that there's tremendous wealth and tremendous power being created, and the biggest factor is just how much data is being collected, and so it's appropriate to get something back for that. If you want to have,
sorry, we're running a little over this panel. Thank you so much. And of course, again, we can always continue the conversation. Always can have a chat going, and also, we'll be sharing all the information and contact information for all of our panelists with the rest of our SALT members today. So thank you so much, folks. And we'll be moving on to our next panel now. And Barry Tabin from AARP, I think, will kick us off the next panel.
Oh, okay. Hey, folks. Linda, can you hear me? I have my headphones on.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, great.
Well, yes.
All right. So just do me a favor. Let me know how long Samantha and I have together until what time?
Let me see if I can minimize, unless Jocelyn knows.
And Jocelyn, can you make my slides a little bigger? Oh my God, I'm such a pain.
I think we've got until 4:10, I think, is when you're supposed to start our next.
Yeah,
4:10.
Okay, great.
But we'll give you a couple extra minutes because we went a little longer.
No worries.
Okay.
Okay, and now I see no slides, Jocelyn, yes? Oh, here we go. Okay, just a little bigger would be great. A little bigger? No? Okay. All right, no worries. I'm going to just excuse my face, folks, when I get really close to the screen. So thanks, everybody, for allowing myself and Sam to talk today about some important tax issues to AARP and also to the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities. So we're going to turn the tables a little bit. We're going to talk for the next few minutes about some tax credits and tax relief that's important to the individual taxpayer, and in particular to moderate and lower income taxpayers. And I'm going to start. I'll talk about two issues that are really important to AARP members, some model legislation that we've drafted. And let me remind everybody that I'm in AARP's national office. My name is Barry Tabenberger, and we have also 50 state offices. And I know that a lot of our legislators today have worked closely with our state offices. And these are some model bills that they're working on at the state level. So if you have questions, I'm happy to answer. And I'm also very happy to put you in touch with our state colleagues. So I think what we're going to do today is I'm going to talk a bit about property taxes, and I'm also going to talk about caregiving. And then Samantha is going to talk about the earned income tax credit and the work the center has done on the earned income tax credit. And so with this, go forward. So many of you know, of course, the importance of property tax revenue, and that it's such an important source of revenue for local governments. So we know that the property tax generates approximately 1/3 of local government revenue nationwide and more than half of revenue in 5 states. And of course, you all know that it funds services that are very important and very visible to taxpayers, like schools and police and fire, EMTs, parks, etc. And we also know, particularly in the wake of the pandemic, that demands for these local services have increased quite considerably. Jocelyn, next slide, please. Okay, great. So just another distinction about the property tax, and that is that it is not directly related to taxpayers' income. So again, the property taxes are based on the value of a home rather than related to a taxpayer's income or ability to pay. And that differentiates them from other taxes, for example. So maybe if your income decreases, you're going to see a decrease in or reduction in your income taxes, and taxpayers can curb purchases to avoid paying sales taxes. And that is much less true of the property tax. So the property tax bill remains the same, regardless of changes to a taxpayer's income. And again, we've seen additional struggles among taxpayers in the wake of the pandemic. Next one, please, Jocelyn. Okay. So as many of you might know, AARP's membership, and that's folks 50 plus, whenever we survey our members, we always hear that property taxes are among the most burdensome tax for our members. But of course, we want to try to balance this with the important revenue that the property tax brings to local governments. Our members also rely on those services and programs. So how do you then come up with targeted relief that balances the need of local governments, but also helps the taxpayer? And so what we've done with these objectives in mind is we've put together 3 different model pieces of legislation. And let me just say that they can, we put down some specifics in the bills, but certainly they can be amended in any way to meet the needs of the states. And I'm just going to quickly discuss them with you all here today. So one of them is a circuit breaker bill, and that will direct relief to seniors with the highest tax burden relative to their income. The next will be a tax deferral measure, and that's going to allow seniors to defer paying some portion of their property tax until they sell their home or they die. And the last one is a monthly tax bill. And so rather than paying property taxes once or twice a year, you would potentially allow a taxpayer to pay their property taxes like you do other bills on a monthly basis. Next one, Jocelyn. Okay, so then the next few pages, and we'll post this presentation online as well, so you can see the details. And in fact, I have even more details than in this presentation, are just some more specifics about the way the model bills are created. So you can see with the circuit breaker is tripped when the level of property tax exceeds a set percent of income. And that helps to target the relief to those who really need it. So folks with the highest tax burdens relative to their income. And as a result, it's a pretty cost-effective way of providing relief. And right now, over 30 states have some kind of circuit breaker, although many of them are not, they don't correlate, the income to the property tax. They just sort of set a level of income, and then they provide relief for folks who have under that level of income. And let's go to the next page, please. Okay, and so here in the model legislation, here are some of our components. And like I say, if a state is looking at this, they can pull any levers they want to make it a little different. Something noteworthy is that this model piece of legislation for circuit breaker applies to homeowners and renters. And we know renters are lower income, really very cost burden, and a lot of relief programs are targeted only to homeowners. And then you can see some of the other components. Let's go to the next one, Jocelyn. Great. And then the next piece of model legislation we have is our property tax deferral. And here is an overview. You can see that over 20 states have some sort of deferral program. One of the important things is that there's no long-term cost to other taxpayers since the tax is repaid when the property is sold or transferred. And a key to deferral programs, and certainly to all relief programs, is to making sure the taxpayers know about them. So raising public awareness through outreach and advertising is really quite key. And let's go to the next page. And here are some components of the deferral legislation. So age 65, owning a home for more than 5 years. Importantly, we've drafted this as a local option. So the state can give the local government the authority, and then the local government makes the determination that they want to implement something like this. And we suggest an interest rate of 4%, although that can be made different certainly. And then there are some other components, and you can have a look for yourself. And let's go to the last one. And the last model property tax bill, like I talked about, is this monthly payment tax bill. So rather than paying your property tax in 1 or 2 lump sums, pay it potentially monthly. And again, this would be a local option. State would give the locality authority. And in fact, when we were doing research for this proposal, I had read about it somewhere, and then in fact found that I think in Wisconsin, there are some communities that are doing this. So let's go to the next page, Jocelyn. And you can sort of see some other components of the legislation. So when a taxpayer makes their first monthly installment, now they're automatically enrolled, so no application is required. And again, like I mentioned, it's a local option and not a requirement. So those are the 3 property tax bills to provide relief to modest and lower income homeowners and renters that I wanted to share with you. And again, if you have any questions, you'd like to talk to me or our state offices, that would be terrific. And then before we go, and I turn it to Samantha, we're going to go to the next page, Jocelyn. I wanted to talk to you about another issue that we've seen get increased attention, certainly during the pandemic, although I will tell you that this is always a significant issue. And I one term heard someone say that, probably all of us at some point in our lives are either going to be a care recipient or a caregiver. So this becomes very meaningful, I think, to all of us. And this is about AARP's state level family caregiver tax credit. And I just wanted to give you just some data about why we are, are talking about this. So this is some information in Alabama. And this is from 2019. We have this for every state. And you could see some of the numbers, 760,000 family caregivers in Alabama, and how their efforts translate into dollars and cents. $11.15 is the economic value per hour, and the total economic value annually is $7.1 billion. And then if you go to the next one, this is national data, again, about the importance of family caregiving. The average out-of-pocket expense for a family caregiver in 2016 is nearly $7,000. And if you're doing it long distance, nearly $12,000. And because of these numbers, which we know have magnified in the wake of the pandemic, I wanted to briefly mention, next page, Jocelyn. Fabulous. Some highlights of our family caregiver tax credit model bill. And again, any of these levers can be changed to meet your state needs, but broadly, it's a non-refundable tax credit of 50% of eligible expenses up to $1,000 maximum. There are pretty broad definitions of eligible expenses: home improvements, assistive technology, home care aids, a broad definition of who the care recipient can be. And the income levels we have now are $75,000 for an individual or $150,000 for a couple. And of course, those can be changed. So I really wanted to make sure we had an opportunity to talk with you a little bit more about the individual taxpayer, especially in light of the pandemic and some of the things that we're doing to provide assistance in those ways. And with that, I'll take questions, and I'm also glad to turn it over to Samantha now.
Thank you so much, Barry. Samantha?
Great. Hi, everyone. It's really great to be with you this afternoon. My name is Sam Waxman, and I'm an analyst with the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. I'll be speaking today about state earned income tax credits and their really crucial role in helping families make ends meet, especially during the pandemic. Next slide. So first, I think it's important to ground this conversation in just the magnitude of how people are struggling right now. The COVID-19 pandemic and economic downturn have really hit hardest people who are paid low wages. They're more likely to have lost their jobs, and people of color, women, and immigrants are overrepresented in many of these jobs due to things like wealth and income disparities, inadequate access to healthcare, and discrimination in hiring. Over a quarter of adults had trouble paying for the usual household expenses, according to a recent census survey, as we see here. Next slide. And while the COVID-19 pandemic has certainly intensified hardship for a lot of families, these trends are longstanding as well. For the most part, as we see in this graph, wages for lower paid workers have stagnated or declined over the last 50 years. That's at the same time that productivity during that time has increased much more quickly. Next slide. In addition, state tax systems that ask the most as a share of income from families earning the least is another thing that contributes to squeezing families between inadequate wages and increasingly expensive basic needs. In 9 out of every 10 states, families earning the least pay a higher share of their income in state and local taxes than higher income families do. Next slide. And so this is really where the earned income tax credit comes in. And along with higher minimum wages, state and federal EITCs help families make ends meet during the pandemic, into the recovery, and hopefully beyond. So here's how the credit works. Working families with children earning up to between $41,000 to $56,000 generally qualify for an EITC, with the largest benefits going to families earning between about $10,000 to $24,000. The maximum credit is going to vary by the number of children that are claimed. Workers without children can also qualify, but the benefit is small, and they can receive it only if their income is below about $16,000 or $21,000 for a married couple. The American Rescue Plan Act increased the credit for these workers, but currently this expansion is temporary and only for 1 year. So this chart shows the credit for a family with 1 child in 2020. The credit increases with earnings until about $10,000 for a maximum credit of just under $3,600, and then begins to phase out at about $19,000 in earnings. Next slide. 29 states plus Puerto Rico and the District of Columbia have adopted state EITCs. Most are modeled directly on the federal credit. They use federal eligibility rules and match a specified percentage of the federal credit. They range from 3% in Montana to 45% in Maryland. Refundability is a really key feature of the EITC because it means that the full credit is available to families no matter how much they owe at tax time. And most state EITCs are refundable, just like the federal tax credit, as we see on this chart as well. Across the 50 states and the District of Columbia, the median income of eligible families is between $11,000 and $20,000. And the most common industries for EITC eligible workers include retail, healthcare, and food service. Next slide. So EITC's benefits go far beyond the dollars that a family receives through the credit. The federal credit reduced poverty and hardship for over 22 million people in 2018, including almost 9 million children. Tax credits like the EITC also are a really big boost for state and local economies because this income helps families keep up that basic spending, and that's going to help economies as well and just help economic growth, especially in a time like the pandemic. Next slide. Research also suggests that the income from tax credits like the EITC helps children from birth through retirement. For instance, this income is associated with improvements in maternal health, and children and families receiving such income tend to do better in school, are likelier to attend college, are likely to earn more as adults, and women in particular are likely to see a more secure retirement. Next slide. States have several options to enact and improve state tax credits. They can enact a new refundable EITC. They can make existing credits fully refundable. They can increase the credit for working adults without children in the home and eliminate the age restrictions for these individuals. They can also end the exclusion for immigrants using individual tax identification numbers or ITINs to file taxes. These individuals don't receive the federal credit, despite many immigrants working in frontline essential occupations, paying taxes, and contributing to their communities. I know we talked about this earlier in the call, but the Treasury Department just released guidance related to the American Rescue Plan Act. Given that the EITC is a tax reduction, the net tax provision that we discussed does come into play here. This is something that we're going to be looking at further and working to understand the full implications of in the coming days. But as states are thinking about EITCs, having a separate revenue source is certainly something that can help alleviate those concerns. Next slide. So between the beginning of the pandemic and now, 7 states have improved their EITCs. It's California, Colorado, Indiana, Maryland, New Mexico, New Jersey, and Washington. 5 have made their credits inclusive of filers who use ITINs, which is very exciting. And for just a few examples, this year, California is issuing additional $600 payments to EITC recipients in the state. And I think about 2 weeks ago, Indiana increased their EITC match from 9 to 10% of the federal credit. And this might not be all. Some state legislatures are still underway. And so more states may continue improving their credits also. Next slide. Just this year, Washington State recently enacted and expanded its Working Families Tax Credit, and that shows how an EITC could work in a state that doesn't have an income tax. Eligible families would apply to the Washington State Department of Revenue. The state will then verify eligibility by matching its information with the IRS information that it receives. And the law also directs the Revenue Department to work with the IRS to pay the rebate automatically if that becomes feasible. Next slide. There's also a number of things can do that states that can help lower barriers to claiming EITC for many families. So they can support free tax preparation through volunteer income tax assistance or VITA. They could pre-fill and send tax forms to families likely to be eligible for EITCs. They could do public outreach, such as through advertising. They could do more targeted outreach to families who are already enrolled in other economic security programs, such as SNAP. And they can also encourage employers to share information about the EITC with their employees. Next slide. I've just given a short overview about the EITC, how it builds on the success of the federal credit by helping families afford the basics, reducing poverty, and helping families thrive in the long run. I'm happy to take questions and to be in touch with anybody who wants to talk about this one. Thank you.
Ms. Waxman, this is John Mocco speaking. Do you have data? So I apologize. The problem with averages is if your head's in the freezer and your feet are in the oven, on average, you're comfortable. My experiences with all the various companies that my family, my sons and my brothers run, we added 165 jobs during this last so-called pandemic and recession. And even the most lowly factory and warehouse workers making in excess of $15 an hour. So my concern is, can you take, and I don't doubt the data that you gave us at the beginning, but can you differentiate between the term essential versus non-essential? In other words, my experience with our 500 employees is that none of that's true, that all of our employees, even at the beginning level, at $15 an hour, did not experience any of those issues during this. And so I think it would be more helpful for us if we could see what that data looks like if we were to differentiate those two groups. That would be beneficial to me as a policymaker, because then I would know who I should be targeting that for. And so I think part of the problem I have with ARPA is that we're spending tons and tons of money and giving it to folks and organizations that really don't need it. And the folks that do need it are essentially getting shortchanged. So it would be more beneficial to me as a policy maker if we could differentiate between the ramifications of, and again, I realize what this will show us. This will show us the fallacy of declaring some people essential and some people non-essential. But that to me is the crux of what we've got to get to, is we've got to look at what was the fiscal ramifications of declaring this person essential and this person non-essential. And I believe that we'd find that all of your data is absolutely correct, but that all of those people that you're referring to, my gut feeling is those are all classified as non-essential workers. And as such, they bore the brunt of the problems last year, because I can assure you, unemployment is now, the low unemployment rate in the state of Wisconsin is a problem. Our revenues are up, everything is booming, and organizations that continue to move forward are moving forward, taking care of their employees, raising the standard of living, raising their hourly rates. And so what would be valuable to me is if your organization could differentiate that, because as we look at policy, we would be able to determine whether that's prudent in declaring some workers essential and some not. And the profound, what I think you'll find is the profound ramification of the non-essential people, which you are right. Those are the folks that least could afford to be to take a hit. And that was where the burden was. The burden fell on those individuals. So to the extent that you have any additional data on that, I would find that valuable.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think in terms of the census pulse data that I had in the first slide about how a lot of folks are finding it difficult to meet their routine expenses. I don't think they have that in terms of essential versus non-essential workers. My general understanding is that at least under ARPA, states can define who's an essential worker. So I think it'd be really hard to generalize about that nationally.
Yes, I agree. And that, I guess that's my point. And so the danger in quoting data like that is that that's not the experience in Wisconsin. That is the experience with a segment of that particular population, with the other half of that population that continue to stay gainfully employed, that continue to see their wages rise during this last recession, are not experiencing the issues you just talked about. And so again, I totally understand that. That is probably hard data to get to, but then there ought to be a caveat as we talk about that, because I think the danger is, and we're seeing that with this ARPA legislation. We're seeing painting a general brush. We're using this information to paint a general economy with the same brush, and that's not true. I mean, we know for a fact all of the last CARE dollars, and much of the last CARE dollars, and much of these new ARPA dollars will go into the bank. Will go to for non-essential, if you will, again, use. They'll be going in. We know if you just look at M1 and the cash, the liquidity that was pumped into the markets. And so again, it's I think it's disingenuous and unfair to talk in general terms. If we can't actually get that data and break that out, then that's a concern of mine. So I would like to see, the data that we could use in really targeting help in the states. And so that I realize that it would be hard to do, but that was just my hope. But yeah, I'm sure it's not.
Okay, thank you for your comments, Representative Mako. Appreciate that. Okay, I think, if there are any other questions for our panelists, we'll move on to our final panel here.
Are you ready, Orlinda?
Okay, let's do it.
Can you hear me?
Sure can.
Well, thank you to the co-chairs and to the staff for inviting me to spend a few minutes talking about state implementation of 988 Suicide Prevention Hotline. I'm Scott Mackey, Leonine Public Affairs in Montpelier, Vermont, and I work with the wireless communications industries on state and local tax issues, primarily with the goal of keeping rates on customers reasonable and supporting a pro-investment tax climate for wireless companies who are investing to bring 5th-generation wireless technologies into your states. So you're probably wondering why a 988 suicide prevention topic is before the task force, and I guarantee you that within in the next 10 minutes you'll have the answer to that question. If you can go to the first slide, I'm just going to briefly talk about the telecommunications tax policy principles that have been a longstanding policy position of this task force. Talk very briefly about the law that Congress passed creating the hotline, how the wireless industry's principles concerning state implementation of the 988 hotline, and then briefly talk about what states have done so far. So if you want to go to the next slide, please, Jocelyn. For one of the earliest things this task force did more than 20 years ago was come up with some principles encouraging states to reform their telecommunications tax policies because they were administratively burdensome. They were not competitively neutral. Some providers were being taxed at much higher rates than other types of providers. There were a ton of industry-specific taxes that are appearing on customers' phone bills that in many cases were not justified. And of course, the reason that NCSL encouraged the states to act was to avoid federal preemption. And in fact, NCSL's longstanding position is to oppose federal preemption. The industry-specific taxes are still a big issue in the states, and the report I co-author every year with the Tax Foundation really shows that there are still 2 states that impose taxes, just state and local taxes of over 20% on the average wireless customer's bill. And there's another 8 states that tax wireless consumers at between 15 and 20%. So generally speaking, in a lot of states, wireless taxes are 2 or even 3 times higher than the general consumption tax in the state. Next slide, please, Jocelyn. So last year, Congress passed the federal 988 legislation, which basically designated 988 to be the National Suicide Prevention Hotline, similar to the way 911 is the emergency services number that everybody remembers. And it requires telecom companies and the states to be prepared to, as of July of this coming year, next year, sorry, 2022, to switch over so that anybody calling 988 anywhere in the country will be connected to a suicide prevention hotline that's staffed by professionals that can assist them with these kind of crises. The federal legislation explicitly allows states to impose 988 fees on wireless and VoIP services to pay for the hotline, but it does not require them to do that. And it's kind of interesting because states don't really need the federal government's permission to impose these type of fees, but nonetheless, the federal legislation says states may impose these fees on wireless and voice over internet protocol. And in fact, states can also impose these fees on regular landline telecom services as they want. So this is the situation. States have until July 22 to prepare. In terms of the wireless industry's position, if you want to go to the next slide, the wireless industry supported the federal legislation and supported designating 988 as the hotline. And we've already started making changes to our networks to make sure that when we do the switch over, that all of the technical issues in terms of getting people to the right place will be in place. We've also, our position is we do not oppose the imposition of 988 fees, but we feel like if you're going to do them on wireless and VoIP, they should be on everybody, competitively neutral, same way as one of the NCSL principles. And then we also think that states, while they can consider 988 fees, this is a very important broad-based service, and states should consider looking at funding a lot of these services out of state general funds. Next slides, please. And specifically, when it comes to fees, if states are going to do fees, they should be kept as low as possible because, as I mentioned, the wireless consumers are already heavily burdened with taxes and fees. And that the fee revenues should be limited to those things that are directly related to the expenses related to call taking and dispatch. So if you think of the 911 system as an analogy, the calls fund the 911 PSAPs and the dispatch and the equipment and the professionals that staff the 911 centers, but they don't fund police and fire and EMS, the actual people who are responding to the 988 calls. And I think, you know, unfortunately, some of the states have been looking at a huge array of services to be funded out potentially out of these 988 fees, things like mobile crisis teams, acute care, and follow-up services. And it's our feeling that the 988 fees should be limited to those things that are analogous to 911, and that these other important services, very important services, should be funded, not be funded from 988 fees. So in terms of an overview of where states are, if you want to go to the next slide, please, Jocelyn. So if you have not seen these bills in your states yet, you're likely to either later this session or next session, because as I mentioned, the July 2022 is the date when states have to be prepared to accept 988 calls and set up call centers. Many states already have suicide lines that are funded, but it's an 800 number and it's really hard to remember. And so the idea is to facilitate this. And when that happens, it's likely to improve the services provided and also increase the number of calls. Some states have come out of the gate in 2021 and gotten sort of an early jump on it. And as you can see, the categories on this map, the states sort of in beige, have passed legislation either putting in place studies or actually funding the startup costs for 988 out of general revenues. And you can actually add Kansas to this list because they their bill did not pass and they did put money into their budget. They adjourned on Saturday night. So there's actually 5 states that have started doing this, either studies or preparation without imposing new fees on consumers. 2 states have passed bills to enact new fees on consumers. The state of Virginia, 12 cents a month to fund the call centers, and the state of Washington, 24 cents a month. There are 7 remaining states that have introduced bills that would impose fees. Some of the fees are specified in statute, but some of them, disturbingly, sort of say the Public Utility Commission shall set the fee to cover whatever the expenses are, which obviously makes us very nervous when we don't know the full range of services and the scope of that. And we would discourage legislatures from granting that open-ended authority and ask to set the statute and fee, the fee and statute. Finally, there are 2 other states, Illinois and Nebraska, where study bills are pending. And then there's a handful of states where the 988 bills have died for this session. So to sum things up, with the last slide, if you will, Jocelyn, most states are likely to see 988 implementation bills. And we hope that, you know, a lot of these bills are starting out in the policy committees, but they're eventually ending up in the Finance and Ways and Means Committee when it comes time to decide what the fees are. And we hope that when those bills do get to your committees, that you'll look at limiting the scope of the fees so that wireless consumers are not ending up paying for a lot of services that really should be are of broad interest to the public, broad availability, aren't really a fee because they're not really tied to the 988 call. And again, if you choose to impose these new fees, we respectfully request that they be limited to those expenses related to call taking and dispatch. I know I went through those slides very closely. I tried to get you guys back on timing here in terms of the meeting. I would be happy to answer questions. I've put my contact information on the next slide. If you have follow-up questions or would like further information on any of the states that are highlighted on that map, happy to share that with you. And again, thank you for the opportunity to just very briefly outline what's coming on 988 and the wireless industry's position. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Scott. Are there any questions from our members that are here regarding this issue or any of the issues from today? Okay. Hearing none. Representative Mako, would you like to send us off? Oh, yes, of course, we've got a couple of upcoming meeting notes here to mention real quick. We are having our base camp session in August, which if you recall last year actually replaced our summit. This year it's not. We're actually having an in-person summit, or trying to have one in November in Tampa. But base camp will still be a good opportunity for members and staff to get an update on the issues that are important for all of our committees as we head into our in-person summit in November, which will be busy. I'm sure we'll be taking up a lot of our policies and issues that we weren't able to take up last year. And our task, our next task. Yes?
Yep, I would say the other thing too then, Erlinda, you and I are working on hopefully having a SALT, an in-person SALT event sometime in September.
Correct.
So we'll do the base camp. Hopefully that's the last online thing. We can get together face to face and talk about some of the issues they talked about at the outset of this meeting, where you have breakout sessions, running into a person, getting coffee. I think that's where a lot of the dynamics and the relationship building comes. So I'm really, really looking forward to getting back to that. I know you've got some bids out for that. So in addition to the base camp online event and then the national summit event, and if you've never had a chance to go to a summit, it's worthwhile. Bring your staff, everybody show up. How many people come to those things? I mean, the last one in Nashville, how many thousands of people were there?
Ooh, you got me. It was a lot. It was, I don't know.
So
five?
it's a wonderful event. Yeah. Something like that. There's breakout sessions all over.
Yeah.
You know, from immigration and taxation to corrections reform to you name it, transportation. There's just a lot of things that you can get at the summit. So I encourage everybody to go there. And then again, as we get more information on our SALT budget and revenue and fiscal leaders discussion for September, hopefully everybody will come to that too. Thanks, Erlinda.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Representative Mako. Yes, and like Representative Mako mentioned, we are looking to have an in-person meeting in September as well. So stay tuned for the details on that. And also want to always thank our sponsors for their support and of our SALT Task Force, of course. And here we have them listed. And yes, well, thank you all for joining us this afternoon. And again, feel free to reach out. You've got the contact information for all of our presenters today. And hope to see you soon and in person.
Bye.